I had no idea what Aaron was talking about, and I understand there were more lectures before this. So, but you will see that a lot of the questions that I touch upon were points that were raised by Aaron. I think that there is a little more to say to this, and I have also a different perspective. Although, in many points, I'm very close to Aaron. But first of all, I'm focusing on one landscape here, which is obviously the one that is also very close to God. It is the Schweller, and if you look in a slightly exaggerated elevations here, you can see that the Schweller is this lowest step west of the Judean mountains or Judean highlands, and just a little bit above the coastal plain. You could, of course, identify to some extent the coastal plain as the land where most of the Philistine culture was recorded. And most of the important sites which are not situated, Philistine sites, which are not located at the coast, they actually sit exactly at the transition from the coastal plain to the Schweller, Ekron and Gad. But they do not sit within the Schweller, which is also interesting. So this is, if you want, a clearly distinguishable landscape in the various landscapes of the southern Levant, which are mostly three of these we see here. The southern Levant would be typically the coastal plain, the hill countries, and the highlands, although these highlands in the southern Levant in Israel never get very high. I mean, 1,000 meters, 800 meters, that would be the highest. And then the fourth landscape that doesn't really appear here are the deserts. But anyway, so the landscape of the Schweller is also very clearly visible in this satellite image. If you look, for example, at Judah, you can see that the amount of green, which is actually vegetation obviously, is very much confined to the valleys, as opposed to these very wide stretches of continuous agricultural areas of the coastal plain. Now, the Schweller is situated as a middle step. We saw a pretty low step, actually, much more connected with the coastal plain than actually topographically with the highlands, is an area that appears here throughout with green. Now that's a modern phenomenon, because after 1948, many villages which used to be in this area were abandoned, and now there are very few ones compared to what there was before. And a lot of this is now a natural environment. And I don't know how many natural parks there are, but there's a lot of continuous bush and woodwork here. So this creates this continuous green areas. Agriculture, and I'm using here traditional land use maps from 1931. This was created, the data comes basically from 1931, from the British Mandate period. But I have in mind also the Ottoman tax registers from the 15th century. Now, if you look at that, it's exactly what we saw, this continuous green area here with our grain production. That's a very important part of the economy in a world that does not use money, that does not really have industry. Everything is really based to a large extent on the agriculture. And if you have a lot of grain, you have a lot of means to hire workmen. You can build large buildings with these workmen. You can have specialists, scribes, and you have maybe also soldiers. The less you have of that grain, with which you can pay your guys, means also the less you can muster and hire people. And if you go up into the higher areas, such as the Schweller, you can see now agriculture is very much confined to these valleys that go into the Schweller. And if you go up to the Judean highlands, you can see now grain production is pretty much confined to very small areas. And of course this has a meaning. It does not mean this is like a determination of what happens here throughout the Iron Age, but it does mean that there are, to some extent, more grain available in the Philistine areas, and it's probably one of the reasons why there was also more population down there. So if the Shvela is, in this case, environmentally, topographically, and maybe even in its resources, so clearly distinguishable, then the question would be, is it also distinguishable in its culture and historical development? And if so, the area, the time period that we're focusing and that Aaron was focusing and I'm focusing on is what I call here the early Iron Age, which means in our present understanding, the 11th and the 10th century, or we would call this RN1 and RN2A early. Now these are obviously now rather modern terms of the chronology. They're based on radiocarbon. They go back the last 15 to 20 years. One thing also, if you know the archaeology of northern Israel, the distinction between RN1 and RN2A is very clear in northern Israel. It's a little bit more difficult to define the transition in southern Israel because we do have, as opposed to the north, a continuation in many sites from the earlier period to the later period. So I think it's justified to talk about the early Iron Age as being comprising parts of the RN1 and the RN2A early. Now, is it a distinct culture area? And of course, Faust and Katz have claimed so. They studied the distribution and the use of Philistine pottery, of collet rim jars, and of pork. And Aaron has mentioned this already earlier, especially on the pork production. And they came to a conclusion that once focusing on these three finds, that there is a clearly distinguishable cultural unity, which they identified as a Canaanite region. Which would mean, we'll later see that there are a number of settlements in this area, in the Shvela, in this early Iron Age, and they would have given a very unified, homogeneous terminology for these. So these are Canaanites. I'm already happy, I have to admit, that they didn't say they're Judahites, because they already distinguish, they bring in a distinction between like Philistines, Canaanites, and Judahites. But what I would like to say is that I think we should really deconstruct these, very much like Aaron said, deconstruct these homogeneous groups and look very much into the details of who are we talking about, what settlement, where, and at one point, and what is found there as opposed to what was found in others. They came to a conclusion that this was Canaanite. They said collet rim jars would have been non-existent in the Philistine coastal plain that we just saw. However, there are Canaanite jars in this Shvela highlands, and they're very abundant in the upper highlands of the Judahite Israelite settlement area. Well, that's a very clear statement, and I must say I don't think that we do have all the data for this. That we do have enough data, for example, in the collet rim jar to really come to such conclusions at this point. I think we need more study of that. Second thing was then here pork consumption. Aaron has already pointed that out. That is there are very clear numbers in Philistine sites. In specific Philistine sites, we have a lot of pork consumption as opposed to others. Canaanite or Israelite sites where we do not have that, and do have to always remind that I talked about Canaanite, Philistine in quotation marks. And Aaron has mentioned already that these are very long traditions also. They go back into the Bronze Age, and already in the Bronze Age we see that the local population does not really like pork so much, you know. So how much is this helping us distinguishing the cultural identity of Philistia? Well, we discussed this. Then, of course, last point, the Philistine pottery. There was this mention that by Faust and Katz, that this appears in very low numbers, but one in the Judean highlands, gradually also lesser so in the Shvela, as opposed to abundance of Philistine pottery in the coastal plain. Now, again, we do not really, I mean, we do have the numbers here because these are not very many potteries, but to go then and say that people consciously avoiding this pottery to maintain ethnic boundaries between them and the Philistines. Them would be then the Israelites and the highlands. So there's a conscious decision. I do not want this pottery in my home because it's strange. It does not belong to my culture. It is maybe that's one of the the context between the lines that this is something even somehow not kosher, you know. It means like, is there already something like a distinction of my culture would have to be pure, and you cannot use this pottery which has symbols on it which maybe not acceptable with me. It's quite a strong statement, and I would at this point, looking at the study of these three groups of finds here, archaeological finds and evidence, I would think that I'm very skeptical that we can use these and develop cultural distinctions which are exclusively focusing on assumed ethnicities. And we should keep in mind, a lot of this is actually emic it's from our point of view. We are putting this ethnic distinctions onto these populations, and it very often canonized. What is that for a word? What is that for a notion? It is not really a notion that relates to anything that was historically anchored in the Bronze Age and early Iron Age. Of course, these notions appear already there in the text, but to understand their meaning and understand the meaning of ethnic boundaries, then that's very much a modern construction. And so I think that we should be carefully and see if we look into the archaeological data and add more data to these, to the discussion than just these three complexes, whether we can have a more complex discussion. First thing, just want to show you all these areas here, blue and red. There are more I should have added. I didn't even bother. There are lots of surveys in the area. There are lots of excavations. The excavations are the points that you can see here with its words. And these are excavations which are relevant for our discussion. And there are many, many of these, although some areas, like southern Judea, are pretty void of modern excavations. Now, if I use this data from excavations and surveys, I'm very well aware that we are looking at the tip of an iceberg. There are many sites that have not been excavated, many sites that we do not know in full detail. Many of these excavations were also small excavations. So if I show you now a number of finds from these sites and try to understand their regional meaning, keep in mind we do not know a lot about this. It's only a tip of an iceberg. On the other hand, if you come from another area from the Middle East, and I work also in Turkey, and I see a map like that, so many excavations in such a small area, it's amazing, you know. Only Israel can provide such an amount of data. But then again, if you look from it from the other side, in the half full, half empty glass, we wish we had more. And especially the surveys. If I start to analyze a little bit the surveys, how detailed, how exact are the survey results? That we don't really, I mean, we know now that we are looking at survey data here, that it not only on survey, but also some of these points are also excavations. But if we rely on this, on data that come from a particular site only from surveys, we know we have to be very careful. In every site that I've excavated, we always collected, first of all, the survey material, and then we started digging. And no big wonder, and in others did that the same, that we came up with very different results often with what was on the surface. So the data, again, you have to be carefully with the data, but look at what there is available and then carefully evaluating it. I distinguish here in the transition from the late Bronze Age to the Iron One, which is the transition more or less from the 12th century to the 11th century. The development in the settlement pattern is something not new. This has been discussed a lot before. I distinguish between sites which were abandoned in this process, which were settlements in the late Bronze Age, which were not settlements anymore in Iron 1, and I marked them in yellow. And you see large areas, large stretches of the southern part of the country are abandoned, and the settlement was not continued. Where was it continued? In places where we have green dots. And in the green dots, you can see sites that now were settled in the late Bronze Age, and they continue now in the Iron 1. And you can see the Schwiller here, you can see the Judean highlands here, and you can see there is considerable change from the late Bronze Age to the Iron 1. What does it mean? If we convert this immediately into ethnic histories, then you could say, okay, we have like red would be the new settlements. We have a lot of Israelite settlement, and we have a lot of Canaanite abandonment, and a lot of change, but then we would have the Philistines here. Does that explain anything? I don't think so. Because ethnicity, I don't think is something that explains something. I think we should we should explain ethnicity against the archaeological data to be more careful. So first of all, we see changes and new settlements in certain topographical units, without immediately going into a identification of what happens there. You may know or not know Gunnar Lehmann's study on the tribe of Judah. Michael was supposed to talk here today. I don't know whether we will read his paper or we have this is the last paper. Okay, so Michael, not in this talk that was scheduled for today, but in an earlier paper, has studied very critically the history of the tribe of Judah, and has deconstructed very much what we usually assume for the early Iron Age Judah, coming to the result that Judah is very much a construction of later periods. Anyway, so you could say a lot of settlements were abandoned here, new settlements turn up here, so maybe those people went to here, or something like that. And that might be indeed one of the possibilities that would explain all the new settlements that you have in the Judean Mountains. But note that you have such developments also further up in the north. And then, of course, we have all these yellow abandoned sites and a few new or continuations here. And I think a very interesting idea by Shlomo Bonimowitz that the new urban centers in the coastal plain, so to speak, collected people, a process that we call synoikosism, which means that they took forcefully, Shlomo claimed, resettled people from villages in this area and resettled that in sites such as Ekron or maybe even Gad. So anyway, so these were some ideas to explain this. Now we're going into the transition from Iron 1 to Iron 2A. And this is a transition that's very hard to date because there's a lot of continuity in the south. But again, the same colors. We have yellow for abandoned sites, green for continuation, red for new sites. I'm working a lot in the southern part of this map in the Nahal Psor. And you can see there is significantly number of new sites in almost every area, except maybe for here, in every area of our study region. In the coastal plain, in the Schwiller, in the Judean highlands, but especially in the southern parts, and especially in the Negev. And interestingly, when Pharaoh Shishak gives his name for his sites in Israel, Palestine, that he mentions there, a lot of these sites appear now in the Negev, and he could not have mentioned these sites before they started to develop. So, in other words, if Shishak mentions these sites, we clearly see that this guy knows the surveys, I said, or knows the map of the Negev somehow.
It weighs.
All right. You have to get in the anyway. And so we see, without going now into a quick interpretation of this, we see a lot of things happening here, and we need a lot to explain here. We see that. Now I'm looking, and this is even more complicated. Not only I'm looking now at the settlement pattern that emerged now in Rn2a. First of all, when is Rn2a or Rn2a early? Is that the middle of the 10th century? Is that the second part of the 10th century? As we've seen, the sites in the Negev, which have this clear Rn2a early pottery, for example, material culture. And Shishak mentions these sites, they must have existed or developed a little before him. And how would we date Shishak? I mean, Shishak was, dated mostly through the Bible. And we don't really have a fixed anchor in the Egyptian chronology, surprisingly, for this guy. And now we can start a large discussion, when does this period Rn2a start having these parameters here? Now, just to remind you, Ami Mazar would put this at 970. Now in the new book, the Hebrew edition, the Hebrew book on the introduction to the archaeology of Eretz Israel, which was from the Open University, they settled now in 970. So things are moving all the time when they come up with these. Yeah. Finkelstein wanted to have the beginning of the Rn2a very low. He talked about 900. Then with Finkelstein, it's very hard to know what he's actually meaning very often. Then he's talking about 920, but then there was another talk where he said maybe it's 930. So he wanted to have it down at around 900, whereas Ami Mazar wanted to have it as far up around 1000 as possible. If you look at the data, a lot is possible around the middle of the 9th century. So we talk about plus minus 950, plus minus 20 years. That's, I think, when this settlement starts to develop that we see here. So that's the chronology. Big question. And it's far from over, that discussion. Second question is, what I try to show here is a hierarchy of the settlement pattern. It's very daring, because this is now not only based on archaeological excavations, but a lot on surveys. How do we possibly know how large these sites were when we not even excavate them? Don't want to go into all the discussions here and the possibilities, but the reasons to believe that most of the sites in this area were actually very small. There was only one in this period, Rn2a, one site that we know for sure was very large. And Aaron has just mentioned that you settled on 50 hectare now, or 60?
Somewhere between 40 and 50.
All right. Would it make it one of the largest sites in the whole country? Not only on this map, it will be one of the largest country, also if you would compare it with the northern part of the country. Now, how large is Rehov, by the way? Rehov is always this very interesting site in the north now.
200, I think.
Hectare? No.
No, 200.
Dunam.
Yeah.
So would it 20 hectare? No? So we'd have like a site here about 50, 40 hectares. Rehov, this other very important site, that survived here, because Megiddo was destroyed and other sites, but it's about 20. Anyway, that given, then there are some towns like Ashkelon, Ashdod, not as big as Gad, but they have like urban characteristics. Ekron, should mention, to what extent it survived from its destruction in the transition from Rn1 to Rn2a is also something we should discuss. But then you have these larger villages. Beit Shemesh, now we know about Kiyav, a larger settlement, whether it's a fortress or a village, it's a question. Lachish starts to develop, apparently. Yossi Garfingen now claims he found a fortification there, something we can discuss. Then we have Etun beginning to grow, Beit Milsim. Now if you look at, these are like larger villages, and keep these in your mind, because they will reappear when we look at finds. There's a very important site, Khubet el-Kom, which was actually very shortly excavated, but not published. But it seems to be very important in this context. Then we have Hebron, and of course Jerusalem, Givon, and others. Now, the excavator, the latest excavator of Hebron, sits with us here, David, and we'll later ask you what do you think about Hebron and its role in this period, What I want to say already at this point out, that I think there's something I would call like role complexity And you see more of it in the Shvela than anywhere else, like in the Judean highlands. Except obviously for one side, Tel Farah South. And Tel Farah South, this is the other side that I'm studying myself, Kubal Walede, and then Tel Farah. And we are now going back for quite a number of years already, going back into the Iron Age 1 and early Iron Age and also LB3 evidence from that site, Tel Farah, and restudying the finds in London and in Oxford and other sites in England from the cemeteries there. It's a fantastic site. A lot of things that appear only are very unique in the archaeology of this period, the early Orange. They appear in the south only at Tel Farah. We have the amount of early Cypriot pottery, for example. And we're talking about Cypriot Geometric 1, Cypriot Geometric 2. There are two sites which are important, Dor, far in the north, and Farah. And we have, we're always focusing on late Helladic 3C. We want to see these bell-shaped balls. But what Farah has is very interestingly, it has Levanto, Cypriot-Levantic pottery from this period. The only other site that has this pottery is Kokino Kremos in Cyprus, or Paleo Castor. Yeah. So sites that around like 1200 existed. Lachish, by the way, has also one vessel from there. So we do have actually Cypriot imports in the 12th century in the south. And where do they appear? Okay, Lachish, one, but in Farah. And Farah is important here. And in my view, when you were showing these connections through the Jordan Valley up to Gad, Farah ought to be on the map, because that is apparently, I mean, Farah was not important. Farah was the station, the first larger settlement when you came out of the desert, and from there we go straight to the Mediterranean. And that brings us to Gaza. What is Gaza? No one knows. You know, the site it's a 1 kilometer diameter tell, huge tell. There are some excavations from the 1920s, like a little sounding.
There's a lot of excavation going on now.
Now, well, look at the publications, right? Actually, you can catch some of this in the art market, you know, the antiquities market. Anyway, so was Gaza important here? Was it of the size of Gad? Did it organize anything of this here, of the Negev settlement pattern? This is an important site, one of the most important sites in this country here, in this part of the map. We don't know anything about it, and that already should give us a huge caveat. Be careful to what conclusions you come. I find it puzzling that Gaza doesn't really appear a lot in the text, you know, ancient text. But I ask you, does Gad? I mean, Gad does, or do you find it somewhere in Shishak's list now, or what's happening here? Is that not worth mentioning, Gaza and Gad?
Well, maybe they were friendly with the Egyptians, so they weren't conquered.
Which would imply that the list has a certain meaning, you know. Mm-hmm. These are the sites that are destroyed. Mm-hmm. But did he destroy these sites? No, I'm not sure. You know, Alexander von Teichen and Finkelstein think that the opposite. They took these sites as a prize and used them, you know. Anyway, more to discuss. And then we have this site Kiyafa. Kiyafa has a fortification around it. And actually, if we carefully look at the other side, it might very well be that other sites were also fortified in this area. But Kiyafa is clearly the most clear site in this area here that has been now excavated and has been firmly attributed to King David by its excavator. Now Finkelstein comes and says, no, it's not King David, it's King Saul. You know, it's like, okay, so we're talking about a few years. How does he know this is Saul? Anyway, you know, but one thing.
You're on camera. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I didn't behave. You know. Oh God. Okay. So what the other thing? All right. Now you have recently published. It just escapes me where. challenged again the question what the site might have been or might have been not. And you mentioned that very correctly what we knew, but it's good to hear you mention it again, that the site was very short-lived. We all agree, I think it's very early on this political map. It's very early on in the transition from Iron-1 to Iron-2A, possibly Iron-2A, but then where is that? Is that in the middle of the 10th century? Is that towards the end of the 10th? Big question. But then it was destroyed very fast, very quickly, maybe a generation or so. What would you think?
The experts claim even
less
years.
Yeah. So it's interesting that on one hand side everything is like grandiose here. It's like the fortress of David, and we have the expansion of Judah. But then it was a miserable failure. You know, he didn't manage to keep that fortress. Whoever built it, if it was one of these. Anyway, so you suggested what I think is right, that it's most probably connected with the expansion of the polity of God. Is that right? Okay. I think so too.
Right, that's what I think.
Okay, no, sure. But it's good if we both think it already, you know? So why would a fortress against the Philistines be located successful in this area when we have the largest city of the largest city in the country at this position, which is a few kilometers, you know? So could someone like Saul or David or whoever from the highlands would build this fortress here? Didn't he play with fire? And building this right in front of the nose of this city of God? I would think yes, he did, no? And they lost it. But once this question comes up with the fortifications, and once that Garfinkel claimed that, here's Caiapha, that this Caiapha architecture is actually typical for Judahite, or Judean, I'd rather say Judahite architecture of the 10th century, of the United Monarchy. So I looked a little bit around, and except for the squares here, which are like town or urban fortifications, all these round dots, I couldn't even put all of them on the map because the Negev highland side would sit further down. There's a lot of fortifications in what? Not in cities, in rural sites. And when? I would think, if not at the very end of Iron-1, as it is apparently in Moab, certainly in Iron-2A. And again, the end of Iron-1 and the beginning of Iron-2A is, in my view, a historical phase. Is very much connected with each other. I think a lot of what is important in Iron-2A started at the end of Iron-1. And one of the things that started, by the way, takes us away for a minute from here, is, in my view, the Mediterranean connectivity that you mentioned earlier. And we see Cypriot pottery coming in, not in big numbers, but coming in the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 10th century. So something connects in the Mediterranean, in the Eastern Mediterranean, that was not so much connected earlier. For example, Philistine bichrome pottery never occurs anywhere north of Tel Dan or in Tyre, on Sidon, or maybe North Syria or Cyprus. Never, you know. Whereas the pottery from there, the wavy line pottery, appears only once in Palestine. That's your shirt that you showed us. That's an extreme exception in a way. But later on, with that, the Mediterranean trade and the Mediterranean connectivity started to catch up, and we have suddenly this new phenomenon. We have now Phoenician pottery that really did not exist before that the slot of a period. And then we have Phoenician pottery in sites like Tel Massos. We have this like one vessel in Jerusalem in the step structure. You remember there was like one of these, not very many, but we do have that. And if we come back for a second to the inscriptions and the epigraphy, he did not mention so much Phoenicia, and I think Phoenicia was in the past. It was always like Phoenicia was the origin of the writing. I think we should keep it in the picture, not because we should think that Phoenicia is the The Phoenicians invented this language, this writing, and they are the only ones who brought it to the south. But I think there's something going on, connectivity. There's a network in this area. I'm not sure how centralized that network is, and I think it is. You mentioned 2 directions. I think it's multi-directional, the network. Because why? Because we see all this pottery in this area appearing. It's very local still. You know, there are very many aspects of local material culture still. That's why I rather think about multi-directional. Coming back to the architecture of fortifications, these are the dots, are fortifications of sites that are rural. There's nothing urban about them. There's no large city temple. There's no palace. There are no even. Very often you don't have large city gates there, but you have a fortification around it. And the evidence, I'm only starting to put this evidence together, but a lot of these sites, Gibeon has a little stretch. I mean, this is probably the site of Gibeon. This is the only thing we know about the fortifications here. We have Hebron. Tell us. I think I looked at your report, and you said there are indications of Iron Age use of the Middle Bronze Age fortification.
Middle Bronze wall, and it's used in the late Iron Age.
In the late Iron Age.
Yes, 8th century. So what happens in between? Does it stand?
Yeah.
It seems to, yes, yeah, I'd say otherwise.
It was probably visible, no?
Yes,
one point. No?
For sure.
Okay, so we put up this on this very questionable map. I put this on. It's not very hard evidence, but something's going on there. And then we have small sites like look at that. This is like a very small stretch of a casemate. What is this actually? It's like houses at the outer perimeter of a hillside settlement that follow the topography. And following the topography, you have houses stacked next to each other like a belt. And the outer front of the houses very often form such a fortification. For example, in Tel Dotan, in Tirzah, you can argue for that, certainly at Tel Nasbe, and possibly also in Beit Shemesh, and definitely at Kiyafa. But in Kiyafa, you don't only have houses, you clearly have a wall that's built. So one has to look at this in more detail, but there's a phenomenon of rural, I call village fortification. And this is a phenomenon of the end of Rn1, but mostly of Rn2a. And something's happening in Rn2a that makes these fortifications necessary. And I think it's not an accident that the Bible tells us, as much as we are skeptical and all this, but maybe a little conservative too. And we think that if the Bible tells us there are lots of changes, political changes in this period. There's King Saul, there's like David and all these guys. And something's happening with the traditional tribal structure of the society up there. And there are changes in the settlement, as we've seen earlier. Something's going on here. We need to understand this much better. And other areas like Moab or the Negev are involved in that. In the Negev, cancel one thing, these are not fortresses or so by Solomon. You know, this is probably a local, in my view at least, a local phenomenon. So, can we then come to any idea about how many people we're talking about? Again, very daring to come to such a conclusion. It's based on the assumption that on 1 hectare, 100 by 100 meter, 1 hectare settlement size, you have a population between 150 and 300, which is a very rough guess, anchored on anthropological research and historical studies, and anchored then on the very doubtful estimate of how many settlements were there and how big were they. Again, so these are lots of things we should keep in mind, but again, pushing forward and trying to say, let's dare to come to some conclusion, I would carefully suggest a population of about 13,000, 10,000, 11,000, 7,000, and here. And all of these negative sites, they're very small, possibly only a population of 1,400 plus. Not talking about the highlands, which is also does not add a lot. Only to give you a proportion, a view, how many people there were. And if we look at Judah, 7,000, this includes a baby and an old fellow or woman. And so how many men would there be? Much less, obviously, than this D100,000 men, which were actually women working harder. No? So it would be. Anyway, so, all right. Now, looking at this settlement again, having all this in mind, and now I'm like putting on this map fortifications, which I think existed in the early Iron Age. And on a white background, so it sticks out a little. And we see suddenly there is quite a concentration of these fortifications, or possible fortifications, in the Schwelar. The last or significant number in the Philistine area is very little on the Judean highland. Jerusalem, by the way, is apparently, here I can turn to Yuval, Jerusalem fortifications, early Iron Age. Again, we have something similar. Would you agree that Middle Bronze Age fortifications were reused in this period, maybe?
In the early Iron Age?
In the early Iron Age. Skeptical. But they were there, right?
I'm not sure that they are Middle Bronze. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Now we're getting to there.
And there's nothing from the Iron One next thing.
Okay.
9th century, yeah, but not 10th century.
Okay. So maybe there should be then.
The 9th century city is ruined, but 10th century or 11th century.
All right. So even less then, yeah? So doesn't leave it. But, okay, fortifications at this point. I would not say that I see any clear ethnic boundaries maintained in this area. It happens to be fortification, happened to be everywhere here. But one thing that does happen, it's gradually less here than there. And it's especially dense in the Schwelar, but maybe it's only more visible here than there. I don't know. But the Schwelar sticks out here, very much so. And of course, in the south, you have only, again, or Farah. I have to admit, too, that fortification is not correct. It's 9th century. I put it wrongly on this. Next find. Burials. For some reason, these are these yellow dots. For some reason, there are lots of burials in the coastal plain and in the Schwelar, but very little to account for in Judah. And from Bethlehem, for example, we have actually only some very circumstantial evidence. And what we do have good evidence from Nasbe and Gibeon, for example. From Hebron, I wouldn't know any early Iron Age tomb. And it just escaped me. There's a little cave up here. I forgot the name. Didn't put it on. And but it's something that does not really appear a lot. These caves, or mostly of these are caves or early Iron Age cis tombs in the coastal plain, they're rich with finds. And these finds we'll discuss in a minute. Inscriptions. There are, God has been mentioned, but look at Gezer, Beit Shemesh, Keyafa, Zaid. A lot of this is centered here. And look at all these combinations, how many of all of this is visible in Beit Shemesh, for example, or in Beit Milsim, for that matter. Egyptian star scarabs, many of which are the post-Ramesside massware, again, appear a lot, and obviously always in the same sites, where they make really rich. And if you look at the Judean highlands, yeah, there is something here. This, well, but that's almost it, Is that, and now I'm going to, is that early Iron Age metal finds. Here I had to rely on the little that was reported and the little that was put on the map. I don't know, Alice, whether you have better maps and more evidence. I tried to really, I did a Google search and I looked and what else do we have? I put all in what I know. Again, Beit Shemesh, obviously Gad, Keyafa important, Beit Milsim, Farah, Jemme. But all the tombs, the Iron Age tombs, are at Tel Jewel, which are also early Iron Age, some of them at least. Not one single find in these. And and then Beit Sur. Beit Sur has iron and copper. Where is can we put a boundary, ethnic boundary on this? Or isn't that just, there are some areas, as Aaron has said earlier, where you gradually have less of all this, which are a little less developed, less rich. Then we have workshops, bronze workshop, iron workshops. As far as I know, we have only these 2 iron workshops in Beit Shemesh and Gad so far. I don't think there's anything else in the meantime. And interesting, if we now ask the question of technology, we do have in Jerusalem a bronze workshop, but iron workshops, those we don't have in the highlands, but where we do have them in the Shvela or just next to the Shvela. I don't know whether you put Gad on the Shvela or I would put it at the border somewhere. No? Then you have a site like Beit Zur, where at least you have iron and copper or bronze objects. You know, so again, what does it tell us? It tells us actually they were in touch. They knew about this. Finds are getting everywhere, but less so here and more there. You know, so there's connectivity. There is exchange. But is there ethnicity here? What is that? And very interesting metal finds are these toggle pins, which are in German Gewandnadel, and fibulas, which are also garment fasteners. So you would close your coat with that. And of course, we have bronze bowls. And it's interesting, these were not on the map earlier. If we look at this now, then we have this, again, very much represented, these finds in the Shvela, again in Farah, but then in Gibeon, it's there. It's there in Bethlehem, in Beit Zahur. It's there in Beit Zur. Beit Zur is even an iron fibula. By the way, what are these iron toggle pin? One thing good about the toggle pins is they disappear in RN2A. They disappear in the 9th century. There they don't really, it's not typical for late RN2A. And so they're really good for dating. And the fibula are exotic. They come from the Greek world, they come from the Balkans, they reach Cyprus. They come very late to the southern Levant, to Israel, Palestine. And when they come, and these are the first finds that we have in the end of the RN1 and RN2A. But the fibula, although they appear quite a lot here, usually do not appear in graves. They're too new, apparently. I don't know, that's my suggestion, you know. They're still exotic. You would put your father in a grave with a fibula, you know? Maybe not. Put a toggle pin, but then they go out of fashion. But certainly, if I have enough money, I'll give him a bronze bowl. Where are these, you know? In Judah, almost nothing there. So technology spreads to some extent, not up to the mountains. But if you look at these toggle pins and these fibulas, is that again, I would not put a toggle pin on me because that's like what? Cypriot? It's like what the Philistines put on their coats? Is that what we can do with this? I think rather talk about something else. So I highlight the Shvela a little bit here. Funny picture there. And I question that this history of the Shvela is an ongoing landscape or battleground for conflicts, ethnic conflicts, even between Israelite and Philistines. I don't think that's a good explanation for what we see. And I'm there because I really like to stick with archaeology. And now I'm going a little bit into the Bible here, only with one sentence. That even the biblical traditions would not report about military conflicts after Saul. I mean, this hero David was killing this Goliath from Gath. After that, he didn't kill a lot of Philistines anymore. Huh? He did, but later on, not. And later on, he would probably bring this wheat and these peas, you know, that you showed us, and we'd probably buy them at Gath, maybe on the market, and then we ship them up there to Jerusalem, wherever he was sitting at that point. Anyway, so that's only one part of the picture. And Of course, size matters. And now I'm repeating what Aaron has said, and repeat here that his study, which I found very interesting, it was quite a deconstruction of what was called the Canaanite Shvela, and not much left after, I think, in my view, after your article with Luis here. And so the question is there a Canaanite population in the Shvela that is ethnically, identically, in their identities distinct from people who live up on the mountains? Is that a complete different population? Do they speak even a different? I don't think. I mean, they were probably speaking the same language. They knew each other. There were only a few hundreds of them. They may have exchanged a lot with each other. So, archaeological evidence at this point, I would think, would supporting an interpretation of a heterogeneous and constantly changing matrix of identities. It's our slang a little bit here, that existed during this time. And I think that this reality is far from clearly demarked ethnic groups operating deliberately in this period as national entities. So the Israelites would think, yeah, okay, the guy from the next village, he's stealing my sheep all the time, but after all, we Israelites, we really hate the Philistines, Then Aaron and Luis further suggested to see the Shvela, and I think found that very interesting, at the middle ground, which means a place where people meet. It's not this, it's not that, but it's a place where you have a lot of, it's all slang now, I beg your cultural negotiations. People meet each other, they exchange stuff with each other, exchange ideas. When we talk about regional local groups, which are not united in politically or in any form for identity. And if I talk about entanglement, I don't know how much you use words like entanglement, but it's a very interesting concept of how people use foreign stuff. It has been discussed if people use Philistine pottery in the country, in the southern Levant, in a different way than it was as is used, for example, in Greece. So, or we can look at the fibulas. For example, fibulas do appear a lot in tombs in Cyprus, but as I said, they don't appear in tombs in the southern Levant. And so I would very much agree with what has been written in these publications, and I think that there is an ongoing negotiation of groups located in Philistia, the Shvela, and the Judean highlands going on the background, what you've seen. And I think they created a fluid and very complex set of dynamic processes, and the results of that is the exchange of materials that we've seen. Then I would like to go forwards and say something that I'd like to be more specific. What is the political or the order, the political, and I call this political economy, using a notion by Max Weber. So there's a specific, I think there's specific sets of how do you organize your political life and how you relate to your neighbors in a political sense, but also the part of the set is the particular forms of economies. And I think these we can distinguish. Various political economies. We can see there are kingdoms, there are urban societies, there are village societies. This all I would subsumize under the word of the notion of political economies. And yes, ethnicity is part of this. I mean, they distinguish it. Well, people are strange to each other at one point. But what does it mean? How do you organize this feeling of that this guy is strange? And is that identity, of course, very important, whether it comes from outside or from inside, who calls you a stranger? And what I would think is very important to look, if we look back also into archaeological evidence, to look into the inequality of the available economic resources and agriculture productivity that we've seen. And I think that may explain the archaeological record much better than the assumed national conflicts and also some doubtful exegesis. Sorry, it's a word I never use in my life. By which I mean, of course, that legendary kings come into the picture, and a history of events is put onto a archaeological record which does not represent a history of events, but rather a structural history of what I think are political economies. And that's the end. So what do I assume? What was the model of all of that? I would think that until like the 10th century, I think there's some evidence that there are like wealthy villages in the Schwela. And and I very firmly believe that there's no political vacuum. If there's a wealthy village and you have the means to conquer them and steal them their sheep and so, you would probably do that. But the fact that this communities like Beit Shemesh, Beit Mirsim, and so on exist throughout the RN1 and are changed only in RN2A probably means that there was something like an autonomous culture there, or autonomous communities, I'd say, much richer than those poorer communities on the highlands. Big question what happened in Hebron and other. But then in the 10th century, especially after the research at Gat, we see that the city of Gat is really getting more and more dominant in the area. And with this, not only Kiyafa disappears, but also this culture of these, what I think were early RNH autonomous villages. There's no place anymore for these. And in the end, we only have two political players. We have the city, the city of Gad, and we have some tribal alliances in the highlands. And I don't think there was space for a third political economy in this area. Maybe in the Negev, we have to see. Last question, how powerful was Gad? And we discussed this a lot, you know. You once wanted me to say, if Gad is the largest city, it doesn't really mean it dominated everything here. But there's no other that I can see. And believing firmly into the non-existence of political vacuums, who else would have done it? Maybe it's Gaza, the unknown player. We don't know. But last sentence, all this is now connected and embedded in this connectivity that's not only Mediterranean, but includes the Arabah and a lot of exchange. And a very important route goes also, I add to your map, through this area now. But Judah is not really in the picture of that axis either. Wasn't in yours. No. Okay, that's it. Thank you.